The cruelest invitations are the ones wrapped in gold. The envelope arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, resting alone in Claire Bennett's mailbox as if it already knew it carried more than expensive cardstock and embossed lettering. The thick ivory paper felt heavier than it should have, and before she even unfolded it, she recognized Ryan Carter's taste for expensive appearances. 3 years had passed since the divorce papers erased her last name from his life, yet somehow his presence still found a way to arrive without knocking. Inside was an invitation to an engagement celebration at the Grand Marston Hotel, the kind of downtown ballroom where crystal chandeliers reflected perfectly polished marble floors, and every guest measured success by the watch on a wrist or the badge on a lapel. At the bottom, beneath the elegant script, another sentence had been added in handwriting she remembered all too well. "Hope you can make it. It would be nice for everyone to see how we're both doing." Claire stared at the words without blinking. Someone else might have mistaken them for kindness. She heard the challenge hiding underneath every letter. Ryan wasn't inviting her to celebrate his future. He was inviting her to become part of the entertainment. She could almost hear the conversations before they happened. There she is. His ex-wife. Remember her? She never really recovered after the divorce. The image formed effortlessly because Ryan had always understood one thing better than love: how to control an audience. Years ago, he could charm an entire room with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Tonight would be no different. The invitation wasn't closure. It was a stage. Across town, Ryan stood inside the ballroom as workers adjusted floral arrangements nearly 6 feet tall, while musicians rehearsed soft jazz beneath glowing lights. He glanced toward the entrance and smiled to himself. A few close friends laughed as he mentioned Claire's name. Someone joked that it took courage to invite an ex-wife. Ryan simply shrugged and lifted a glass of sparkling water. "Life moves on," he said with practiced confidence. "Sometimes people need to see it for themselves." His guests nodded, believing every word. None of them noticed the satisfaction hiding beneath his calm expression. He wasn't expecting drama. He was expecting silence, the kind that follows quiet embarrassment. Back inside her apartment, Claire folded the invitation carefully instead of tearing it apart. The afternoon sunlight stretched across hardwood floors, warming framed photographs that no longer included Ryan. The apartment wasn't extravagant. It was peaceful. Every piece of furniture had been chosen by her alone. Every window opened to a view she had earned. She placed the invitation on the kitchen counter beside a cup of cooling coffee and stood there listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, and her own steady breathing. There was no anger left to feed, only memory. Her phone buzzed with a message from an old mutual friend. "Heard you're invited. Are you actually going?" Claire looked at the screen for several seconds before typing only 3 words. "I'll be there." She pressed send, locked her phone, and slipped the invitation into her purse. Outside, evening settled over the city as office towers reflected the fading orange sky. Somewhere beyond those buildings, engines quietly started, schedules shifted, and a black luxury sedan rolled away from a private underground garage toward a destination no one at Ryan's party could possibly imagine. Claire never saw it. Not yet. But the night Ryan believed he had carefully arranged was already beginning to move beyond his control. Claire slept well that night, surprising even herself. The invitation remained inside her purse instead of the trash, not because it deserved a place in her home, but because it no longer possessed the power to disturb her peace. Years earlier, a single message from Ryan Carter could have unraveled an entire week. Back then, she measured her happiness by the warmth in his voice and the approval in his eyes. She had believed that marriage meant building one future together, even if it required placing one dream behind another. She remembered the tiny apartment where they had started, barely 700 square feet, with mismatched furniture, purchased from weekend yard sales, and a coffee maker that leaked every morning. Ryan often laughed about those days, promising they would someday own a penthouse overlooking the city skyline. Claire believed him. While Ryan chased promotions and networking events, she quietly carried the weight that never appeared on resumes. She managed the bills, organized their moves, celebrated his victories, and comforted him after disappointments. When he accepted a demanding management position that required late nights and constant travel, she left a growing marketing career because he insisted that one stable partner would make life easier for both of them. At the time, Sacrifice felt like love. Months turned into years, and success slowly changed the rhythm of their home. Ryan's tailored suits became more expensive. Business dinners became more frequent. Conversations became shorter. Eventually, silence filled spaces where laughter had once lived. Claire noticed the smallest changes first. He no longer asked how her day had been. He answered messages while she spoke across the dinner table. Weekend breakfasts disappeared, replaced by conference calls and unexplained meetings. None of those moments ended a marriage by themselves, but together they built an invisible wall that neither of them acknowledged. Then came the afternoon that remained sharper than any argument. Ryan walked into their living room carrying a folder instead of flowers. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her of anything. He simply explained, with unsettling calm, that they wanted different futures. He believed they had grown apart. He believed ending the marriage was the mature decision. Claire listened without interrupting, searching his face for hesitation that never appeared. The papers rested between them on the coffee table while the clock on the wall continued ticking with indifferent precision. She signed because love could not survive where respect had already left. Within weeks, mutual friends quietly drifted toward Ryan. They admired his confidence, his growing career, and the effortless way he controlled every version of the story. Claire never defended herself. She never posted cryptic messages online or corrected whispered assumptions. She packed her belongings into a rented moving truck, handed the keys back to the landlord, and drove away before sunrise with everything she owned fitting inside a modest apartment that felt unfamiliar but honest. Standing in her kitchen now, 3 years later, she opened a cabinet and reached for a simple ceramic mug that had survived every address change. Steam rose from freshly brewed coffee as morning sunlight spilled across the counter. She looked out the window at people hurrying toward offices, carrying briefcases, backpacks, and unfinished conversations. Life had continued without asking permission from anyone. She picked up her phone and opened the invitation once more, reading Ryan's handwritten note without emotion. Then she folded it neatly, slipped it back into its envelope, and placed it beside her keys. Whatever waited inside that ballroom in 2 nights was no longer connected to the woman who had signed divorce papers with trembling hands. Ryan believed he had invited the version of Claire he remembered. He had absolutely no idea that the woman preparing to walk through those doors had already left that life behind long before the invitation ever arrived. The evening of the celebration arrived wrapped in the soft glow of city lights reflecting against polished glass towers, and the Grand Marston Hotel looked exactly as Ryan Carter had imagined it would. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway while valets greeted guests by name. Cameras flashed at the entrance, and laughter drifted through the revolving doors before disappearing beneath the sound of a string quartet inside the ballroom. Ryan adjusted the cuff of his tailored tuxedo and scanned the growing crowd with quiet satisfaction. Every executive he hoped would attend had arrived. Former colleagues from years past filled the room with familiar smiles and polished conversations. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across marble floors, making every champagne glass sparkle as though success itself could be poured into a crystal flute. He accepted handshakes, posed for photographs, and introduced his fiancée with the effortless confidence of a man who believed every chapter of his life had unfolded exactly as it should. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the entrance. He never admitted it aloud, but he was waiting for one specific guest. Across the ballroom, 2 women who had once worked with Claire quietly exchanged curious glances after noticing the extra place card near one of the reception tables. One leaned closer and whispered that Ryan had actually invited his former wife. The other raised her eyebrows in disbelief before looking toward the entrance as though expecting something awkward to happen at any moment. Their curiosity spread through nearby conversations with surprising speed. By the time another round of drinks was served, several guests had already begun wondering whether Claire would be brave enough to appear. Ryan overheard enough whispers to know his plan was working. He smiled politely without adding a single comment, allowing everyone else to create the story for him. Then, almost exactly 15 minutes after the official reception began, the revolving doors turned once again. Claire Bennett stepped into the hotel lobby alone. She wore an elegant navy evening gown that reflected quiet confidence instead of extravagance. There were no diamonds competing for attention, no dramatic entrance, no attempt to impress anyone. Her posture remained relaxed as she thanked the hostess, accepted directions to the ballroom, and walked forward with measured steps that echoed softly across polished stone. Several heads turned before anyone recognized her. Conversation slowed. Glasses paused halfway toward waiting lips. Ryan noticed her from across the room and felt an almost imperceptible smile appear. This was exactly how he had imagined the evening beginning. He crossed the ballroom with practiced confidence until he stood only a few feet away from her. "Claire," he said warmly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I honestly was not sure you would come." She returned a calm smile. "You invited me." Ryan chuckled lightly, drawing the attention of those standing nearby. "Everyone, I would like you to meet my former wife, Claire. It has certainly been a long time." The introduction landed exactly as he intended. A few polite smiles appeared. Others exchanged uncomfortable looks without saying a word. Claire noticed every expression but reacted to none of them. She simply thanked the guests for welcoming her and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. Her composure confused people more than any emotional reaction could have. Ryan waited for hesitation, embarrassment, or regret. Instead, he found only quiet confidence resting behind her eyes. Outside the hotel, beyond the bright entrance and beneath the glow of the city skyline, a long black luxury sedan slowed to a smooth stop beside the curb. The valet immediately straightened his jacket, recognizing both the vehicle and the distinguished man seated inside before the rear door gently opened. Claire did not turn toward the entrance when the hotel staff suddenly stood a little straighter. She noticed the subtle change only because years of disappointment had taught her to observe the room instead of demanding its attention. The music continued without interruption, champagne continued to flow, and conversations resumed after the brief curiosity surrounding her arrival. Ryan drifted back to greeting his guests, convinced the evening had already unfolded exactly as he intended. Claire remained near one of the ballroom windows overlooking the glowing skyline, her fingers lightly resting against the stem of her glass. She looked completely at ease, almost as though she had come to admire the view instead of relive a painful chapter. That quiet confidence puzzled several people more than tears ever could have. One former coworker cautiously approached her with an awkward smile and asked how life had been. Claire answered honestly, "Peaceful." The single word lingered longer than a complicated explanation ever would have. Before another question could follow, movement near the entrance gently redirected the attention of several hotel employees. The valet hurried forward, followed by the guest relations manager, both greeting a newly arrived guest with the kind of professionalism usually reserved for someone whose name carried unusual significance. Claire still did not look. She simply took another calm sip of sparkling water while soft piano notes drifted through the ballroom. Ryan noticed the reception from across the room and instinctively glanced toward the lobby. He could not clearly see who had arrived because several people briefly surrounded the entrance. Assuming it was another executive from a neighboring company, he returned to his conversations without another thought. The distinguished gentleman who had stepped from the black luxury sedan entered the hotel with effortless composure. His charcoal evening suit was perfectly tailored without appearing flashy, and the only watch on his wrist reflected understated elegance instead of unnecessary wealth. Hotel staff greeted him by name in respectful voices, but the music and conversations inside the ballroom swallowed those words before anyone nearby could hear them clearly. Rather than entering immediately, he paused in the lobby to exchange a few quiet remarks with the general manager, then accepted directions toward the ballroom with an appreciative nod. There was no entourage surrounding him, no photographers, and no attempt to attract attention. The confidence he carried came from never needing to prove who he was. Inside, Claire's phone vibrated once inside her evening clutch. She excused herself from a nearby conversation and glanced discreetly at the screen. A single message appeared. "I have arrived." She smiled so gently that no one standing beside her noticed the expression. Her reply contained only 3 words. "Take your time." She returned the phone to her purse without another glance toward the entrance. Ryan happened to notice the brief smile and misunderstood it completely. Walking back toward her, he folded his hands comfortably and lowered his voice just enough to sound sympathetic. "I appreciate you coming, Claire. I know evenings like this cannot be easy." She met his eyes with complete calm. You seem very confident about knowing what is easy for me. Ryan laughed politely, assuming she was attempting to protect her pride. Before he could answer, one of the hotel executives hurried across the ballroom toward the entrance with visible urgency, adjusting his jacket while quietly instructing members of the staff to prepare for a distinguished guest. Several attendees exchanged curious looks. Nobody knew exactly who had arrived, only that someone important had just entered the building. Claire remained exactly where she was, serene and unhurried, while beyond the ballroom doors measured footsteps drew closer with every passing second. The ballroom doors opened with quiet elegance, yet the change in the room was immediate. Conversations softened without anyone asking them to. The hotel general manager personally escorted the distinguished guest inside, speaking with the careful respect reserved for someone whose influence extended far beyond a single evening. Ryan noticed the movement and instinctively straightened his posture. He searched his memory, convinced he had seen the man somewhere before, perhaps on the cover of a business magazine or at an industry conference, but the name refused to surface. The guest thanked the manager with a brief nod before continuing alone, moving through the ballroom with unhurried confidence. He acknowledged polite greetings with a warm smile, but never lingered long enough to become the center of attention. That alone made him different from nearly everyone else in the room. Ryan watched him for another moment before quietly asking one of his colleagues, "Do you know who that is?" The colleague frowned, studying the unfamiliar face from across the ballroom. "No idea," he admitted. "Someone important, apparently." Meanwhile, Claire remained by the window, her attention resting on the city lights beyond the glass until she sensed someone approaching beside her. She turned slowly, and for the first time that evening, genuine warmth softened her expression. The gentleman smiled with effortless sincerity, the kind that carried neither surprise nor performance. "I hope I did not keep you waiting," he said. "Not at all," Claire replied. "You arrived exactly when you meant to." There was no dramatic embrace, no exaggerated display designed for curious eyes. He simply accepted the sparkling water a passing server offered and stood comfortably beside her as though they had shared quiet evenings like this for years. Their conversation began with ordinary things. He asked whether the drive across town had been pleasant. She mentioned that the weather had finally cooled after several unusually warm days. They spoke about the view from the ballroom windows and laughed softly over a restaurant they both planned to revisit the following weekend. Nothing about their exchange suggested an attempt to impress anyone. That simplicity made several nearby guests even more curious. Ryan noticed Claire smiling in a way he had not seen in years. It was not the smile she once forced through difficult evenings. It was lighter, calmer, almost effortless. For reasons he could not explain, the sight unsettled him. He crossed the room carrying 2 glasses of champagne before stopping beside them with polished confidence. "Claire," he said pleasantly, "I do not believe we have met." The gentleman extended his hand without hesitation. "Alexander," he replied simply. Ryan shook it firmly. "Ryan Carter. Thank you for joining us tonight." "Thank you for having me," Alexander answered with perfect courtesy. Ryan waited for a last name that never came. He assumed Alexander was either a friend from Claire's new social circle or perhaps someone she worked with. His confidence quietly returned. Whoever this man was, he certainly did not appear interested in making an entrance. That fit perfectly into Ryan's expectations. After exchanging a few more polite words, Ryan excused himself to greet another arriving guest. As he walked away, he glanced back once and noticed Alexander gently pulling out a chair before Claire sat down at one of the cocktail tables. It was a small gesture, almost invisible amid the elegant surroundings, yet it carried a quiet respect Ryan had forgotten to offer years before. Across the ballroom, the chairman of one of the largest investment firms in the state had just entered through another doorway. His eyes scanned the room for only a second before they immediately settled on Alexander, and his expression changed with unmistakable recognition as he began walking directly toward him. The chairman crossed the ballroom with unmistakable purpose, weaving through clusters of executives without once taking his eyes off Alexander. Several conversations faded into silence as guests instinctively stepped aside, curious to see whom a man of his stature considered important enough to greet first. Ryan noticed the movement and smiled politely, assuming the chairman was coming to congratulate him on the engagement. He adjusted his jacket and took a small step forward, preparing to extend his hand. Instead, the chairman walked directly past him without slowing. He stopped in front of Alexander, his face brightening with genuine respect. "Mr. Sterling," he said warmly, offering both his hand and a slight nod. "It is an honor to see you again. I did not know you would be joining us this evening." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. Ryan's smile remained frozen, but confusion quietly settled behind his eyes. The last name struck something familiar deep in his memory. Around the ballroom, several guests exchanged puzzled glances, each trying to connect the name with articles they had read, interviews they had watched, or annual business rankings they had skimmed only weeks before. Alexander returned the handshake with effortless humility. "Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate your kind words. I am here for a personal reason tonight." Daniel smiled knowingly before turning toward Claire. "It is wonderful to see you again as well." Claire greeted him with the relaxed confidence of someone who had shared previous conversations instead of formal introductions. They exchanged a few pleasant remarks about a recent charity fundraiser before Daniel politely excused himself to greet other guests, leaving behind a ballroom filled with quiet curiosity. Ryan stood perfectly still. Sterling. He had definitely heard the name before. He reached for his phone beneath the table while pretending to answer a message. Typing quickly into a search engine, he entered 2 words. Alexander Sterling. The screen loaded almost instantly. A professional portrait appeared beside headlines from major financial publications. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Global Holdings. One of the youngest billionaires in the country. Investor. Philanthropist. Business leader. Ryan stared at the screen, reading the same lines twice before they fully registered. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from disbelief. Sterling Global Holdings. The parent company. His own employer was only one division inside that enormous corporate network. He slowly lowered the phone, suddenly aware that his palms had become damp. Nearby, whispers began spreading through the ballroom with increasing speed. Guests discreetly searched their own phones. Faces changed one after another as recognition replaced uncertainty. Executives who had barely noticed Alexander earlier now glanced toward him with unmistakable admiration. A regional vice president quietly adjusted his tie before walking over to introduce himself. Another business owner postponed his conversation halfway through a sentence, hoping to exchange even a brief greeting with the renowned executive. Yet Alexander seemed completely unaffected by the growing attention. Rather than accepting the center of the room, he remained seated beside Claire, listening as she described a small community literacy program she had recently begun supporting. He asked thoughtful questions, smiled at her answers, and gave her his complete attention while the rest of the ballroom gradually realized exactly who had entered among them. Ryan watched the scene unfold with growing unease. For the first time that evening, he understood that the carefully arranged spotlight he had prepared was no longer shining where he intended. The room had quietly shifted around someone he had dismissed only minutes earlier, and although nobody had announced it aloud, the balance of the entire evening had already begun to change. Ryan had built his career on reading a room before anyone else could, but that ability abandoned him as the atmosphere continued shifting beyond his control. The conversations surrounding him no longer revolved around his engagement or the elegant reception he had spent months organizing. Instead, guests discreetly stole glances toward the quiet man seated beside Claire Bennett. Executives who had barely acknowledged Alexander only moments earlier now waited patiently for an opportunity to introduce themselves. Even people who considered themselves influential seemed careful not to interrupt his conversation. Ryan forced another smile as he greeted arriving guests, but every polite handshake felt strangely hollow. Across the ballroom, Claire remained exactly as she had been all evening, composed, relaxed, and entirely uninterested in becoming the center of attention. Alexander listened as she described a literacy initiative that provided free business workshops for women rebuilding their careers after major life changes. He asked thoughtful questions, not because anyone else was listening, but because her answer genuinely mattered to him. There was no performance between them, only mutual respect expressed through simple attention. Nearby, one of Ryan's senior directors quietly approached him with an expression he had never worn before. "Ryan," he said under his breath, "why did you not mention Alexander Sterling was attending tonight?" Ryan hesitated for only a second before answering honestly. I did not know who he was until a few minutes ago. The director blinked in disbelief. Do you understand who is sitting at your reception? Ryan nodded slowly. I do now. Before another word could be exchanged, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage and welcomed everyone for a brief toast honoring the newly engaged couple. Glasses were lifted throughout the ballroom as applause echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers. Ryan thanked everyone for attending, delivering the polished remarks he had rehearsed countless times. He spoke about new beginnings, success, and appreciating the people who supported life's important milestones. When the applause faded, he looked across the room toward Claire with what he hoped appeared to be generous confidence. I also want to acknowledge someone from an earlier chapter of my life, he said. Claire, thank you for accepting the invitation. I truly hope you have found happiness. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward her. Claire slowly rose from her chair, setting her glass onto the nearby table with steady hands. Thank you, she answered warmly. I genuinely wish the same for you. Nothing more. No bitterness. No accusation. Her calm response left the room unexpectedly silent. Ryan had prepared himself for discomfort, perhaps even emotion. Instead, her quiet dignity made his carefully planned moment feel strangely insignificant. Then Alexander stood beside her. He adjusted his jacket and rested one reassuring hand lightly at the center of Claire's back before looking toward Ryan with a courteous smile. Congratulations on your engagement, he said sincerely. It takes courage to begin a new chapter. I hope it brings you both lasting happiness. Ryan thanked him automatically, but before he could say anything else, the chairman who had greeted Alexander earlier raised his glass from across the ballroom. To Alexander, Sterling, and Claire, he called with genuine admiration. It has been far too long since we have seen the two of you together. Dozens of guests instinctively turned toward the couple once again. Ryan frowned almost imperceptibly. The chairman's choice of words echoed in his mind. Together, not acquaintances, not colleagues, something far closer. The realization hovered just beyond reach, and as Alexander gently looked toward Claire with unmistakable affection before offering her his arm, Ryan suddenly understood that the evening still held one truth far greater than the identity of a billionaire chief executive officer, and whatever that truth was, it was about to change everything he believed he knew. Silence settled across the ballroom with a weight that no orchestra could soften. Every guest remained focused on Alexander and Claire, waiting for someone to explain what had just become impossible to ignore. Ryan stood beside the stage, still holding his champagne glass, feeling as though the room had quietly shifted beneath his feet. The chairman smiled warmly as he approached the couple once more. I must apologize, he said with an easy laugh. I assumed everyone already knew. He looked toward Ryan before continuing with genuine sincerity. Alexander and Claire have been one of the most respected couples at our foundation events for quite some time now. They have supported more community programs than most people realize. The words landed gently, but their impact echoed throughout the ballroom. Ryan stared at Claire, searching her face for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, he found only the same calm expression she had carried from the moment she walked through the hotel doors. She had never hidden anything. She had simply never announced it. A guest standing nearby smiled at Claire. Mrs. Sterling, the scholarship program you launched last year changed my niece's life. She talks about you all the time. Claire thanked her with quiet grace. She earned every opportunity herself. We were only fortunate enough to help. Ryan barely heard the rest of the conversation. Only two words continued repeating in his mind. Mrs. Sterling. His attention shifted slowly toward Alexander, who never corrected anyone, never emphasized his position, and never sought recognition. The truth revealed itself without a speech because everyone around him already understood it. Alexander glanced toward Claire with unmistakable warmth before speaking in the same composed voice he had used all evening. My wife has always believed that real success is measured by the lives we improve, not the titles we collect. There was no dramatic announcement, no attempt to impress the room. Yet that single sentence changed everything. Claire was not simply attending with a billionaire chief executive officer. She was his wife. A quiet wave of astonishment spread through the guests. Several people who had spent the beginning of the evening whispering about Ryan's former marriage now looked toward Claire with entirely different expressions. Respect replaced curiosity. Admiration replaced sympathy. Ryan remembered every assumption he had made when she first entered the ballroom alone. He had believed she came to witness his happiness. Instead, she had arrived already living her own. One of Ryan's colleagues leaned close enough for only him to hear. "Do you realize Sterling Global owns our entire corporate group?" Ryan answered without looking away from Claire. "Yes." The single word felt heavier than anything he had spoken that evening. Across the ballroom, the chairman invited Alexander to say a few words to the guests. Alexander politely declined with a smile. "Tonight belongs to Ryan and his fiancée. Claire and I are grateful simply to celebrate with everyone." His refusal carried more dignity than any prepared speech could have. Claire gently reached for his hand, and he accepted hers naturally, without hesitation or display. It was a simple gesture between two people completely comfortable in each other's presence. Ryan watched their hands for only a moment before lowering his eyes. Years ago, Claire had reached for him with that same quiet trust, and he had been too focused on ambition to understand its value. Now the ballroom no longer saw her as the woman he had left behind. They saw her as someone who had built a life defined not by revenge or resentment, but by character, purpose, and quiet strength. Without raising her voice or defending her past, Claire had transformed the evening into something Ryan had never anticipated. The person he had expected to embarrass had become the one everyone admired, and she had accomplished it without trying to win the room at all. The celebration continued, but the energy inside the ballroom had changed in a way no one could ignore. Conversations returned little by little, yet they carried a different tone now, softer and more thoughtful, as though everyone had quietly witnessed something far more meaningful than an elegant engagement party. Claire never sought another conversation about herself. She thanked the guests who approached her with genuine kindness, congratulated Ryan's fiancée with complete sincerity, and smiled as she wished the couple every happiness in the years ahead. There was no trace of triumph in her voice because she had not come to compete with anyone. Ryan watched from across the room, realizing that the woman standing before him no longer resembled the person he thought he had known. For years he had convinced himself that success was measured by promotions, expensive hotels, executive titles, and the admiration of strangers. Claire had walked into the same ballroom, carrying none of those things on display, yet somehow she had become the person everyone respected most. Not because of Alexander's fortune, but because of the quiet confidence she had earned long before anyone recognized the man standing beside her. Alexander checked the time on his watch before turning to Claire with the same calm smile he had worn all evening. "Whenever you are ready," he said gently. She nodded once. There was nothing left to prove and nowhere else she needed to be. Before leaving, she walked toward Ryan one final time. The music softened behind them while nearby conversations respectfully faded into the background. Ryan looked at her for several long seconds before speaking. "Claire," he said quietly, "I was wrong about many things." She met his eyes without resentment. "We all learn at different times." There was no accusation hidden inside her words. No satisfaction. Only honesty. Ryan lowered his gaze briefly before looking back at her. "I hope you are happy." Claire smiled, and for the first time that evening the answer arrived without hesitation. "I am." It was the simplest sentence she had spoken all night, yet nothing else carried more weight. Happiness was no longer something she hoped another person would give her. It had become the life she built through patience, resilience, and self-respect. Alexander joined her quietly, offering his arm without interrupting the moment. Ryan extended his hand toward him. "Take good care of her." Alexander accepted the handshake with sincere warmth. "She has always been more than capable of taking care of herself. I am simply grateful that she allows me to walk beside her." Ryan nodded slowly, understanding the difference between possession and partnership far too late. Together, Claire and Alexander walked toward the grand entrance beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. No one applauded. No dramatic farewell followed them. Guests simply stepped aside naturally, watching them leave with quiet admiration. Outside, the cool evening air welcomed them as the city lights shimmered across the streets. The black sedan waited patiently at the curb while the driver opened the rear door. Before stepping inside, Claire looked once toward the illuminated hotel windows. She remembered the woman who had once believed losing a marriage meant losing herself. That woman no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone stronger, kinder, and freer than she had ever imagined. The car pulled away smoothly, disappearing into the rhythm of the city while the lights of the hotel slowly faded behind them. Inside the ballroom, Ryan remained standing beside the window long after many guests had returned to their conversations. He finally understood that the greatest loss of his life had never been a marriage ending. It had been failing to recognize the extraordinary woman beside him until she no longer belonged in his story. Claire had never returned to reclaim the past or to make anyone regret their choices. She had returned only as living proof that dignity never needs to announce itself. It simply grows, quietly, until one day the entire world can see its light.